him. They will never yield him willing service. Nay, unless they establish their complete happiness in him, they will never give themselves truly and sincerely to him. In his commentary on Psalm 22, verse 5, Calvin writes this: "The papists show themselves so stupid and so ridiculous that it is unnecessary to spend much time in refuting them. What resemblance is there between their childish fooleries, with which, according to their own imagination, they attempt to appease God, and this holy testimony of gratitude, which not only a true sense of religion and the fear of God suggest, but which God himself has commanded and ratified in his law." God's whole law is live your life in gratitude. Yea, how can they have the force to equal their foolish and infamous superstitions to the most precious of all sacrifices, the sacrifice of thanksgiving? Calvin restored to the church the proper worship of God, beginning with the great motivation for worship, the praise of God. What were the fundamental principles that undergirded Calvin's and the Reformation's restored worship? The fundamental principles that came to expression in the public worship of the churches of the Reformation. Tonight, I want to identify briefly with you 7 outstanding principles of Reformed worship. Principles identified by Calvin and principles upon which Calvin based the proper worship of God. First of all, undergirding Calvin's whole endeavor on behalf of the proper worship of God by the church was the conviction that it is the will of God that his people, his redeemed people in the world, gather for public, corporate worship. This is a fundamental aspect of God's will for worship that we must not lose sight of. It is the will of God that the believer engage in private and personal worship. Each of us, daily at the very least, bowing before God in personal prayer and in the reading of his word, private devotions. It is also the will of God that believers engage in family worship. Fathers and mothers at a family altar with their children, whether at meal times or at another time, for the reading together as a family of God's Word, for prayer, family prayer, a father leading his family in that important aspect of worship. One of the fundamental reasons why believers must marry in the Lord, so that you can establish a home in which there will be proper family worship. But besides personal worship and family worship, it is also the revealed will of God that believers gather for public, for corporate, we say. Corporate means as a body, for corporate worship of God. Calvin's exposition of the first and second commandments of God's law is an exposition. He gives that exposition in more than one place, both in his writings and in his sermons, is an exposition of the first and second commandments that is invariably framed around the presupposition that God calls his people to worship him as a body, to worship him together in the congregation. Calvin's conviction in this regard included his insistence on a proper observance of the weekly Sabbath. Apart from that proper observance of the Lord's Day, there cannot be any pleasing worship of God. Included in that insistence of Calvin on diligence in observance of the weekly Sabbath was his insistence on faithful attendance at the public worship services of the church. Well, as a matter of fact, there were many other, in fact, there were daily public worship services in Calvin's Geneva. And Calvin preached many of those worship services and led many of those worship services, but particularly his insistence that observance of the Lord's Day cannot take place apart from diligently frequenting the house of God, to use the language of our Heidelberg Catechism. Here Calvin, in his exposition of Psalm 95, verse 6, he writes, "We are also to observe that mention is made not only of inward gratitude," there's that motivation for worship again, "but the necessity of an outward profession of godliness." These words, the words of that text, imply that to discharge their duty properly, the Lord's people must present themselves a sacrifice to him publicly, with kneeling and other marks of devotion. Commenting on Psalm 22, verse 25, he writes, the psalmist repeats what he had touched upon a little before, that he will show the tokens of his gratitude in a public manner in order thereby to edify others. That's the first outstanding characteristic of Reformed worship. Second, Calvin emphasized the necessity for reverence in worship. Reverence in worship. Public worship always characterized by reverence. That reverence is due to what worship is.